gracious, you came back. I'm so thrilled. Oh my goodness. I just want to say a few thank yous before I launch in today. I want to thank my introducers. So for 11 years on this faculty, I had to stay in town every convocation week when my colleagues were going off to interesting places or holed up working on their stuff and introduce the lecturers. So I want to express my extreme thanks to Dean Sterling, to Danielle McCrae, to Carolyn Sharp, who make me sound so much better than I am. So I thank you. I also want to thank all of you who have attended these lectures, whether 1, 2, or 3, and I know some of you have come a long distance to do so. It has been such a delight for me to be back in this place, connecting with alumni, with former students, with faculty colleagues, with administrative staff, with people I've just known and loved here, and to be in this chapel that just always holds a special place in my heart. I love Marquand Chapel like many of you alums do, and I'm so grateful to be here, right here. When they asked me where I wanted to be, did I want to be up there? I said, heavens, no. Oh, mercy, no, that's not Marquand anymore. This to me is Marquand. And I want to thank my family. My husband, Alfred, who through the 45 years of our marriage, when I have felt one interesting call after the other, has never said never, has always said, we'll work it out, and always has worked with me to work it out. I am so grateful to him. To my awesome children and my awesome grandgirls who are taking off work and school today to be here, and my wonderful daughter-in-law. Thank you. It just means the world. I have Grammy's support team sitting right there. All right. In 1983, I, a newly ordained Presbyterian minister, and co-pastor with my husband Alfred of 4 little churches in Central Virginia, was elected a delegate from the Presbyterian Church USA to the 6th Assembly of the World Council of Churches. Frankly, attending that meeting and being immersed for 10 days in worship and Bible study and conversations around issues affecting our world with Christians from all over the globe still stands as one of the great highlights of my life. Our worship that week took place in a big yellow and white striped circus tent set up on the campus of the University of British Columbia. On Sunday of that week, the World Council of Churches was, for the first time, able to celebrate the Eucharist together because of the baptism Eucharist and ministry document that had been studied by the churches for several years before that. Not everybody there participated in the Eucharistic part of that service. Some intentionally opted out. But for the first time, Christians who wanted to participate in a global ecumenical celebration of the Lord's Supper on a scale never before envisioned were able to do so. While I've forgotten a lot of what happened in that service, I have not forgotten its spirit. People literally came from north and south and east and west to partake together at the table spread before us. They came dressed in their finest outfits from diverse cultures around the world. Musicians from all over the globe led us in lively hymns and music. Scripture was read and prayers offered in multiple languages. And a highlight of the service was when all of us stood together and said the Lord's Prayer, each in our own language. But the visual I most remember was of 2 of the 7 celebrants at that service standing side by side at table with the emblem of the World Council of Churches, a ship setting sail with a cross as its mast behind them, issuing the invitation to all of us to come. One of the celebrants was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie. The other was a woman, a Danish Lutheran clergywoman who had on this beautiful long white robe with a ruffled collar, co-presiding at the table. For many people who were present that day, I am guessing it may have been the first time they'd ever seen a woman co-celebrant at a Lord's Supper. I wrote an article for one of my church's publications about that experience and titled it, "A Taste of Heaven." For in many ways, I glimpsed worship that day as expansive, as inclusive, as celebratory as any I ever hope to experience again on earth. And the presence of that Danish woman pastor at that table, where Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox Christians and Pentecostal Christians all gathered together, was an important visible sign that the old era of a male-dominated clergy was coming to an end, and a new inbreaking of God's inclusive reign was coming into existence. And I knew even then that preaching and worship would never be the same. Today, I want to talk about the transformation of preaching as it has happened in this small part of the globe, the United States of America, as a result of the ordination of women. To assist me in that task, I have asked each of the 16 foremothers in homiletics that I interviewed for these lectures this question. From your vantage point, what difference has the presence of so many clergy women and women homiletical scholars made in how we experience and perceive preaching today? The women I interviewed had varied answers to that question, but what I want to do this morning is focus on 8 significant changes they identified as coming about as a result of the ordination of women, and invite us all to think about how women clergy have literally transformed preaching this past 60 years. Number 1, the first change I note may be obvious, but that does not discount its importance. The sheer presence of women and womanly bodies in the pulpit has, for many young girls, teenagers, young women, transformed their understanding of who can speak for God. Jennifer Brooks, professor of preaching at Garrett Evangelical Seminary, put it this way: visibility, just the visibility of women does something for the church. In the Black Baptist Church, being a first lady is a big thing, but you know the identity of the first lady comes out of the male pastor. The fact that we women can take our place in the front seat and can actually be the voice for God, the voice that represents who God is. That's what's important. That's what makes a difference. Several women I interviewed talk about the vocational pathways that are now open to girls by the sheer presence of women in ministry. While many of these homiletical foremothers never themselves heard a woman preach till they got to adulthood, they rejoice that we are now raising up generations of young women who have known the presence of women in the pulpit and at the altar since childhood. And what a difference that presence makes for how young women view their own vocational options. Martha Simmons, founder of the African American Lectionary, thinks it not only makes a difference for opening pathways to ordained ministry, which it certainly does, but also the vocational path toward theological scholarship. Says Simmons, I think the increased numbers of women in the pulpit also helped boost the number of women scholars, period. Young girls went to church, saw women in the pulpit, said, well, I may not want to be a preacher, but I'd sure like to teach. I'm so excited by the young scholars, she says, that I've seen come through in the last 15 years. And I believe they saw women in the pulpit and said, I think I can do that. I can do that. Recent statistical studies bear out in a more systematic way the significant ways in which having clergy women as mentors in early life transform the lives of children, youth, and young women. 2 political scientists, Benjamin Knoll and Cammie Jo Boleyn, recently undertook studies of women and men to see how their experience with male and female clergy growing up had affected their self-esteem. They found that for women, self-esteem overall increased 18% when they had had significant female clergy leaders in their youth. Interestingly, they found that for men, self-esteem was not perceptibly changed one way or the other by whether they had male or female leaders. But these authors go so far as to say, in summary, the self-esteem gap between men and women might be eliminated entirely in a world where women have female clergy at least some of the time in their formative years. And let me remind you, these are not self-interested clergy making this. These are political scientists. In addition, Knoll and Bolin found other interesting evidence of the influence of clergy women on girls' and women's lives. They found, for instance, that women whose most influential congregational leader growing up was a woman receive on average 1 additional year of schooling over women whose most influential religious leader was a man. 15.1 years of education versus 16.2. I can't help but note that that 1 year might make the difference between getting a college degree and not. Furthermore, while they found in their survey that 61% of women and 74% of men reported they were currently employed full-time outside the home, a gap of 13%, that gap entirely disappeared when a woman reported that her most influential religious leader growing up was a woman. Those women, they report, are employed at the same rate as men. These findings seem to reinforce Martha Simmons' observation that having clergy women as pastors not only opens religious vocation as an option for girls and young women, but opens them to receiving further education and pursuing other full-time vocational options as well. Furthermore, while these scholars give evidence that the presence of women in the pulpit does not negatively affect boys' self-esteem, I can't help but wonder what it does positively for boys and for young men. We live in an era when, as the Me Too movement and national discourse at the highest levels have clearly shown us, misogyny is far from dead. And its evil, vitriolic effects are experienced not only by young girls, but also by young, impressionable boys. I cannot help but think that seeing women as trusted religious leaders in their youth must have some positive effects on our boys and our young men as well, and affect the ways in which they treat women in their adulthood. I am hopeful that in the future, studies might be undertaken that assess those positive effects as well. Second, the effects of clergy women on God imagery and body imagery. Certainly, the presence of women speaking on behalf of God ultimately affects the way they perceive God as well. Speaking out of her own Roman Catholic tradition, Sister Joan Delaplane, retired professor of homiletics at the Aquinas Institute, laments, one of the things that is painful is that people in the pews, women in the pews and children, young people, they don't see the woman up there and how their image of God can also represent the one who speaks for God. There is a sadness for me that they do not experience or think of an image of this great God in any female terms. In her book entitled She, 5 Keys to Unlock the Power of Women in Ministry, Caroline Lewis, professor of preaching at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, reinforces Delaplane's point when she writes about what's at stake for her in women claiming their rightful places in ministry. Women in ministry give witness to the breadth and depth of what we dare to imagine is the potential and possibility of God's grace. When our voices are sidelined, when our presence is questioned, when our presentation of the gospel is called into question, it is never, ever just about us. It is also about the imagination of God. When our imagination for God's hope for the church is undermined by our lack of imagination, that is when God becomes less than God. Lewis also links Jesus' own incarnation with the necessity for women's embodiment in preaching. Preaching, she writes, is a necessary act for understanding the theological promise of the incarnation. The Word becomes flesh again in proclamation, incarnated anew in the body. To take the incarnation seriously means that women have to take their bodies seriously. This is true. It is also true that taking their female bodies into the pulpit has not always been easy for women. As we have witnessed through these lectures, the pulpit was for many, many generations a sacred space where only male bodies were welcomed, and still is in some traditions. The transgressing of that space in order to incarnate the gospel in a bodily way has often been challenging. I cannot tell you how many women, clergy women of my experience, after preaching their hearts out on Sunday morning, have had people come out and speak to them, commenting on their hairstyle or their earrings. And I'm seeing lots of nods of recognition around this room. The men don't get that. A lesbian woman of my acquaintance was actually asked by someone on a pulpit search committee if she would consider changing her hairstyle and mode of dress to make her look less, lesbian. Women have had to pay far more attention to what they wear in the pulpit than their male counterparts. And a woman homiletician, Amy McCullough, wrote an article several years ago about the challenges of being a pregnant preacher and the liberties so many parishioners felt they could take in patting and touching her body. Liberties they never would have taken with a male body. I still remember one of my early parishioners, an elderly woman in a small church in ministry where I was serving right out of seminary, calling me to her house and taking me to task for even using the word pregnant in the pulpit. To her way of thinking, even language about birth and gestation and women's experience thereof had no place in the pulpit. Yes, embodiment for women and navigating its nuances while hanging on to a woman's own sense of integrity and personhood can be incredibly challenging. Yet the more women take their rightful places in the pulpits of this land, the more they express through their embodied proclamation the wonderful diversity of what God has created us to be, the more they also open up paths of diversity for those who follow in their footsteps to be their full selves as well. Christine Smith's words rang true to me in my interview with her when she said, "I feel like as time kind of marched on, I feel like women got more and more empowered and free to truly bring all of their women's self to the task of preaching. In the beginning, we were weighing everything. We were weighing what we wore. We were weighing the language we used. We were weighing everything. It felt like we had to. And it feels like as time wore on, women did not have to leave out parts of their humanity. I still think we have to be careful. We're not in an ideal world. Women can't just do anything and have people continue to respect them. There are rules that women still have to play by in the institutional church. But, says Chris Smith, I feel at least we've had a voice in making some of the rules now." Number 3, women's experience in preaching. When I asked the foremothers of homiletic what the biggest changes were that women had brought to the pulpit, many of them commented in one way or another on the significance of bringing women's life experience into the pulpit. Sister Joan Delaplane responded this way: "What is significantly unique in a woman's preaching? I really haven't come to an answer to that question, except to know the stereotypes don't fit. To say that the woman's preaching is going to be more compassionate, more personal, more sensitive, I haven't found that necessarily. We have so many wonderful preaching men who are sensitive and compassionate and creative and gifted. However, I think there's no question about the fact that men and women experience life differently. Therefore, when they approach the Word of God and they have their congregation in mind and experience where God is at work in the world, there's a difference. I don't know many men who would find in the preaching experience a birthing metaphor. Yet it is for me, and it fits. Minerva Carcano, the first Latina bishop in the United Methodist Church, responded in this way: "What difference have women in the pulpit made? I think it's made the witness more whole. I love to sit with a book written by a woman, a commentary on passages of Scripture, a book about the church, and hear the view of women. It's different. I think of those passages in the Old Testament of women being raped, of women being oppressed and dismissed. And to hear the voice of a woman who has had some of those experiences and articulates what it feels like as a woman, it's so eye-opening. It feels like, yes, that's what I feel. It brings the Scriptures to life. It brings a perspective that's been missing. It makes our life richer because it's now shared." She continued, "I think that's true in women's preaching as well. The stories of being out in the field and seeing the vineyard from the perspective of a woman who sets the table with those grapes and that wine is different. And it's a contribution we are less rich without." As I mentioned in the first of these lectures, I grew up in the 50s and 60s hearing all sermons by men, many of them very good sermons, I might add. They nearly all had a 3-point framework, incorporated lots of interesting examples and illustrations, and held my attention even as a child. I used to ride the circuit with my dad, and there were some of his sermons I knew by heart. But in retrospect, I also remember how filled they were with examples from the male world. Sports stories, war stories, stories about cars and trucks, stories about fatherhood. It was not until I first started teaching my Women's Ways of Preaching class 25 years ago and heard one of my students, who is here this week, use the image of her mother quilting in a sermon with the visual of a quilt spread on the communion table as she spoke, or heard another student in that same class preach the first sermon I ever heard on the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael, or later heard another student preach on the Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1, that I realized how starved I had been for stories that lifted up and highlighted women's everyday experience. Some of us have now come to take such sermons for granted, and certainly during recent decades, traditional gender roles have morphed and changed so that many of the gender stereotypes that once frequented pulpits thankfully no longer fit. Our granddaughters these days would be just as likely to illustrate a sermon with a sports story as our grandsons. But what we need to remember is that such was not always the case. And one of the ways preaching women have revolutionized the pulpit is that they have claimed it as a space in which to interpret theology and life through the vantage point of their unique experiences and perspectives. As Minerva Carcano rightly observed, that has made preaching and its witness more whole. Number 4. Reclamation of biblical texts and topics not previously preached. Barbara Lundblad, professor emerita preaching at Union Seminary in New York and a former Beecher lecturer, remembers sitting in this very chapel in 1982, 37 years ago, when Phyllis Tribble, a feminist scholar of the Hebrew Scriptures, gave the Beecher lectures. Tribble was the first woman to give a full set of these lectures. One laywoman, Helen Kenyon, had given one of 7 lectures in 1950. But Phyllis Tribble in 82 was the first woman to give a full set of these lectures. These were the lectures that became Tribble's classic book, Texts of Terror. And significantly, the subtitle she gave her lectures at the time, a different one from her book, was Unpreached Stories of Faith. Lundblad recalls, when she, Tribble, talked about the dismembered woman in Judges, that her body was broken and given to many, and she lifted up the exact Eucharistic words you could have heard a pin drop. She continues, I love the kind of work Tribble does with text, and that there are women who have really not only been deconstructive of text, but have looked at text in such detail. It's been a different way of interpreting Scripture. Women Scripture scholars have opened up text in a way that just wasn't true for many, many years. Mary Catherine Hilkert, professor of theology at Notre Dame and another former Beecher lecturer, echoed similar sentiments. When I asked her about the difference women preaching have made, she said, I think central would be biblical hermeneutics, the feminist biblical scholarship. I'm really delighted to find that male as well as female students are searching the feminist or womanist or mujerista or post-colonial or liberationist hermeneutical resources there are now there for biblical scholars. I think we all know now there's not one central commentary or one meaning of a text. That's been huge. Both Lundblad and Hilkert point to the fact that women preachers have not opened up new biblical texts on their own. They have been greatly assisted in that endeavor by the many outstanding feminist and womanist and mujerista, etc., biblical scholars who have given them new lenses for reading the story of Hagar, the story of the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, the story of Vashti and Esther, the story of the Canaanite woman with the flow of blood, and the texts of terror in the Hebrew scriptures that Tribble opened for us. Consequently, many women have been encouraged and inspired to bring into the pulpit texts and topics they might not have preached on otherwise. One of the assignments I've given my Women's Ways of Preaching class through the years is to preach a sermon on one of those texts of terror in the Hebrew scriptures. As a consequence, I have heard incredibly moving sermons on rape, incest, domestic violence, genital mutilation, and the like. These sermons simply would not have been preached 50 years ago. And indeed, it takes a great deal of courage to preach them now. But by so doing, women as well as courageous men are opening up texts that have long been ignored or glossed over by the church, and have painfully named the experiences of misogyny and oppression all too many women have experienced, not only in biblical times, but today. As a result, the pulpit has become a more honest and transparent, and yes, more challenging place to be. And our image of God has moved beyond sweetness and light to become the image of the God whose body was broken with ours, whose blood was shed with ours. Number 5, a safer space in which women and others previously oppressed can hear sermons. When I asked Barbara Lundblad about the harm she thinks has been done to women by the lack of women's ordination for so many eons, she responded this way. A friend of mine, someone I have come to know through church circles, said to me quite a few years ago, I feel safe when you preach. I thought at the time, this means she has not felt safe. Lundblad continued, women have heard demeaning things said about women in the pulpit, almost as a toss-away line. A little illustration about a silly old woman. I mean, in a way that is usually not said about a silly old man. Just those kinds of diminishment and demeaning, and then downright dangerous. I think in terms of LGBT people, yes, terribly dangerous things have been said. So women didn't hear their lives affirmed in any way. I think it's the harm of neglect, and it's also the harm of diminishment and demeaning that women have heard over the years. Some of my beloved preaching colleagues here at Yale Divinity School, many of whom are right here in this room, but we can testify that over the years in our preaching classes, we have heard a lot of students talk to us about the harm and diminishment and demeaning that has come through the church and its preaching. And when we put those realities within the larger conduct of the sexual misconduct and pedophilia and gender and sexuality shaming that has gone on in the church for decades in the name of God, it is no wonder that many women and a number of men and transgender folk as well no longer find it to be a safe space for them. One of the things women have brought to the pulpit is the overturning of some of that diminishment and demeaning language. Some of it came through reinterpretation of biblical characters like Hagar and Miriam and Mary Magdalene. Some of it has come through the positive image of women used in the stories told and the examples used that women have woven into their sermons. Some of it has come through the exercise of a leadership style that invites and encourages participation, not authoritarian acquiescence. And some of it has come from the sheer presence in the pulpit of a woman who also openly advocates for women. I currently worship in a church in Durham whose senior pastor is a woman. I'm looking at her right now. She came all the way from Durham with her pastor mama to go to these lectures. God bless you, Mindy. And I recently told her that one of the great gifts to me in worship is that I don't have to worry about something offensive being said or done. Rather, I look forward to worship where women and men, gay, lesbian, and transgendered persons, babies, and teenagers are all welcomed and all invited into a space that is genuinely safe and encouraging and life-affirming. Would that that were the case in the whole Church of Christ. And I think it is largely thanks to women's modeling and men's growing sensitivities to women's concern that the church is becoming a safer space for all. Number 6, authority in preaching is exercised in a less hierarchical, more invitational way. One of the questions I asked the women I interviewed was to reflect upon the way in which authority had been redefined for them in light of women's preaching. Alice McKenzie, professor of homiletics at Perkins School of Theology, echoed the sentiments of a number of these foremothers when she said this: I think authority is morphing from, top-down authority to the authority of authenticity. I think that's what resonates with a lot of people in a postmodern era. They aren't so willing to do something just because I said so, like the kind of parental homiletic. As I tell the students, the best way to be the real deal, the best way to appear to be the real deal, is to be the real deal. McKenzie continued, of course, classic discussions of the inner calling emphasize the church's call and the bearing of fruits. I'm sure there's an authority that comes from preparation. That's important. There's authority that comes from inward call. There's an authority that comes from the church's call. But the way I look at it, we don't possess authority. We participate in divine authority by being our authentic selves. Participating in a gift is different than claiming superior status. Lucy Rose was one of the original foremothers of the Academy of Homiletics, a person who ushered many of us early women scholars of preaching into its midst with an outstretched hand and a vibrant spirit. Lucy Rose lived a radically welcoming Christianity in the entirety of her life, and at the time of her all too early death to cancer, her household consisted of her spouse, Jerry, her young daughter, Lucy Mack, and 2 formerly homeless men, Dean and Louie, who lived with them as family. In her book, Sharing the Word, Preaching in the Round Table Church, Lucy Rose redefined authority in the pulpit in a highly postmodern manner. Rather than viewing authority in a hierarchical way, with the preacher being the ordained person sent by God who brings divine truths to bear in as persuasive a way as possible, Rose revisioned preaching as a conversational event in which the preacher brings to the congregation a tentative interpretation of Scripture that acknowledges as best it can its limitations and its biases. The sermon's content, Rose writes, is a wager on the part of the preacher, a new insight that has brought comfort and challenge that is then submitted to the community of faith through the sermon for their answering meanings. For Rose, the sermon was not the end of the process, but the initiator of a process that continued into the future. Of critical importance to her in that process was actively summoning marginal voices in the congregation and beyond, and hearing their perspectives on those texts as well. Maggie Wenning is a Reformed Jewish rabbi, the only Jewish rabbi, I would reiterate, who has attended the Academy of Homiletics meetings for several decades. Maggie became interested in preaching because she felt it was the weak link in her own seminary training. And so she sought to expand her knowledge of homiletics by regularly attending our academy meetings and interacting with homileticians there. She also preached regularly at Beth Am Congregation in Manhattan while preaching at Hebrew Union College and Jewish Institute of Religion in New York City. Maggie reports that when she first went to the Beth Am congregation, they had a tradition going back 25 years of gathering after the main worship service on Friday nights with coffee and tea and intimates to discuss the rabbi's sermon for an hour. She says the feedback helped her immeasurably with her preaching. She also invited 4 to 6 members of the congregation who disagreed with what she said in the pulpit to offer their perspectives at worship on Yom Kippur afternoon. And while she was away on sabbatical, she trained members of the congregation to read from the Torah, to lead worship, to give sermons. This practice continued once a month after she returned. Says Wenning, in terms of authority, I feel like, or I believe, that my authority doesn't supersede the authority of my congregants. And my freedom in the pulpit comes from granting everybody else the same freedom. I never, ever had to second guess what I was going to say. I never had to worry about what people's reactions could be because their reactions were welcomed, whether it was after the service or when they had the opportunity to speak from the pulpit themselves. That granted me freedom of the pulpit. Both Joan Delaplane and Mary Catherine Hilkert reminded us when I interviewed them of a key theological reason that Christian preachers too should be engaging in that kind of sharing of authority. Namely, that for Christians, the ultimate authority for preaching is not granted through ordination, but through baptism. Our authority to preach, says Sister June, is rooted in our baptism that we must share in word and deed and life. Clericalism, said Kathy Hilkert, is a huge problem in our churches, and women in the Roman Catholic Church do not exercise their gifts for preaching based on orders. It comes out of baptism and confirmation. It comes out of a call from the Spirit. One of the gifts women have brought to the pulpit is to challenge top-down notions of authority and redefine authority in a way that stresses both authenticity on the part of the preacher and a more shared and conversational style of preaching. As a consequence, preaching has become a far more communal endeavor than it used to be in the days when it was the congregation's job to remember, reiterate, the 3 points of the sermon as the pastor delivered them to them. Number 7, expanded use of narrative and narrative structures in preaching. When I asked Janet Childers, professor of preaching and academic dean at San Francisco Seminary, what changes she thought the women in the academy and a parish had brought to preaching, she immediately responded, well, Nora, we broke it open, didn't we? Or at least we were there at the moment to be a big part of the breaking open. Partly because of us, the narrative movement in preaching got an extra push under its wings. There was so much affinity between women's experience and women's ways of thinking about the world in our generation as we were conditioned and acculturated. So much match between our experience and worldview and the narrative movement. Jean Lowry and Fred Craddock were before us, of course. but we extended things beautifully, in my opinion, through our use of story and bringing in women's ways of telling stories. The two male homileticians to whom Childers is referring, Jean Lowry and Fred Craddock, both former Beecher lecturers, urged preachers to use more inductive and less deductive sermon structures as ways of engaging congregations, and modeled for us how to preach in ways that both use stories well, in Craddock's case, or structure the sermon like a very interesting plot of a novel. But the larger reality to which Childers points is that many women were also there, cheering those homileticians on, because the way toward which they were pointing in their homiletical theory was also the way in which women were naturally finding their voices coming to expression in the pulpit. Mary Lynn Hudson of Memphis Theological Seminary echoed Childers' sentiments, which she said in relations to the changes women have brought to preaching. There's a lot more narrative. There seems to be more self-disclosure from the pulpit, a lot more dealing with issues of interrelatedness. Through women's attention to those human relationships and how important they are in relating the reality of God and community with each other. I also think, she said, there's greater attention to narrativity, telling the story, because I think women are more sensitive to the fact that we all live by different narratives. And the stories are what connect us in community and with one another. By sharing those stories, we find identity and empowerment. I was reminded, as Hudson spoke, of how little personal disclosure there used to be in the pulpit of another era. Indeed, there was a whole generation of white males in the mid-20th century who were taught in seminary never to talk about themselves in the pulpit, because to do so always distracted from their pointing to God and God's word that had been entrusted to them. The theological assumption was that the word of God flows through the preacher, and one of the preacher's jobs is to get completely out of the way so God can speak without human interference. Pam Durso, executive director of Baptist Women in Ministry, has published several volumes of women's sermons. When I asked her what, if anything, she found to be distinctive about the sermons in her collection, she commented on several things, including the way in which women tend to be narrative preachers. But she qualified that narrativity. Women, she said, tend to share personal stories that make them vulnerable. Then they invite people to identify in the sermon with their own vulnerabilities. We have a far more embodied and incarnational sense of preaching these days, and in part it's come through that revival of narrative and personal storytelling. Of course, we always have to be on guard against preaching in which the story runs away with the sermon. I've heard plenty of those. And we all know that narrative and personal sharing can be used for ill as well as good. But I would still contend that a pulpit is a more accessible and humane place these days because the gospel has been brought right down to the ground of human experience and the scriptures enfleshed in daily life in a way that allows people to glimpse God in their very midst. Finally, number 8. Theologizing from a women's point of view. Preaching, of course, is a theological endeavor. We are always in preaching, whether we realize it or not, shaping and reshaping theology as we interpret scripture and tradition and contemporary life and their relations to one another. So preaching by women is not only about bringing women's experience into the pulpit, it is about crafting theology through the lens of that experience and challenging theologies that do not lead to the liberation of all peoples, including women. Once again, women have been aided in this process by the many feminist, womanist, mujerista, native Asian theologians who have gone before us and stood alongside us. These lectures take place in a divinity school where the shadows cast by trailblazing theologians, Letty Russell, Margaret Farley, Emily Towns, loom large, and where new visions of a theology that is liberating for women and men alike have been birthed and nurtured. The church as a household of freedom in which God is the householder, housekeeper, Letty Russell. The Ethics of a Just Love, Margaret Farley. Womanist reinterpretations of evil and suffering and ethical responses to them, Emily Towns. These are among the many theological contributions of women that have shaped our preaching and influenced our thinking and led women to challenge oppressive theologies of the past as they offer up new interpretations in the pulpit. Certainly, the cross has been a key place where women preachers and women theologians have been pressed to redefine traditional theologies in ways that do not make God out to be some cosmic child abuser and Jesus some passive acceptance of the violent will of God. Scholars of preaching like Sally Brown in her book Crosstalk have joined forces with womanist scholars like Joanne Marie Terrell in her book, Power in the Blood, to challenge traditional interpretations of the cross and Christ's suffering, while also evidencing the harm those interpretations have done to women who have been told by the church to submit and sacrifice themselves like Jesus did, even to abusive partners. Christine Smith's seminal work, Preaching as Weeping, Confession, and Resistance, Radical Responses to Radical Evil, wrestles with how preaching can be a redemptive and not an oppressive activity in a world of radical evil. She writes, part of our resistance to evil must be work that is theological in nature and content, critiquing theologies of the cross that justify and condone human suffering of every description is an act of resistance. Suggesting that persons with disabilities know and experience God in ways able-bodied persons do not is an act of resistance. Participating in the redemptive work of breaking silences surrounding rape, incest, and woman battering is an act of resistance. Preachers and communities participate in resisting evil as they critique and uproot the theologies that undergird it and seek to build new theologies that bring embodied justice to the world. Women preachers and scholars of preaching have often led the way in breaking silences, in reinterpreting theologies, and helping us see all people created in the image of God in ways that have challenged our cultural and traditional norms. In the process, they have also urged the church to weep with those who weep, to confess our own complicity in human suffering, and to resist with all our beings the forces of evil in the world. Some of the homiletical foremothers that I interviewed for these lectures commented on how significant feminist and womanist theology has been for shaping who they have become as preachers. Mary Lynn Hudson, the first woman professor at Memphis Theological Seminary, says, feminism, if anything, has taught me to look always for the subversive element in Scripture and theology. That what the reality of Jesus does for us is it opens up the contradictions in our systems that seek to control reality, but God is bigger than that, and God is always in the process of subverting our certainties. Barbara Lundblad reflected on the influence Letty Russell's theology had in her own preaching. We've been celebrating in Minnesota, she said, the 25th anniversary of the Reimagining Conference of 1993. I think of Letty Russell, she said, and being one of my teachers at Yale, and how she opened up just a whole new way that meetings ought to run, or how people should get together and share leadership rather than having one person at the top, and have a round table rather than a proscenium stage. For Jennifer Brooks, a feminist or womanist perspective in homiletics presses us to ask questions about what we are writing about. We can't simply write about the things that concern women, says Brooks. We've got to write about everything. To be in the middle of all the important issues, that's for me where we women have to make a difference. To put our feet in the middle of the mess and to speak out loudly and strongly so they can't avoid us, that's what I think is critical. If you survey the books written by women homileticians, past 30 years or so, you will find that women have indeed been writing about everything. They have written about drama and performance in preaching, voice in preaching, creative writing for preaching. They've written about biblical hermeneutics in preaching, theology in preaching, the history of preaching. They've written about congregational context for preaching, how to preach through congregational resistance to change, the process of birthing the sermon. They've written about wisdom preaching, prophetic preaching, roundtable preaching, and they've written about preaching that is more sensitive to people with disabilities, preaching in Korean American cultures, preaching at weddings, and most recently, preaching to churches that fall in the purple zone, a very handy volume today. Women have indeed put their feet in the middle of the mess and have theologized about how to preach for a wide variety of listeners in a wide variety of settings. And in the process, they have challenged, expanded, and transformed how the field of homiletics thinks and what it thinks about. When I asked Christine Smith, the author of the first homiletical treatise, feminist homiletical treatise, how she saw the changes women had brought to the field of preaching, she responded in this way. I do feel that women have revolutionized the church. I do. I've never said that before, she said. I think that's extremely optimistic, but I actually believe it. And I think from everything to how we run a meeting, to how we preach, to what we do in worship, and the bigger way many of us understand worship, and just how we do pastoral care, I really think that people have been on the receiving end of tons of change. And I don't even know if you ask people if they recognize key moments. I don't even know if they'd be able to say, but it just slowly and steadily and persistently, I think, has been a revolutionizing of a field and the practice of ministry. As you probably gathered, I heartily concur. In ways many of us could not even begin to name or identify or recognize, clergy women and other women in ministry have been revolutionizing the practice of preaching and other practices of ministry for decades now. And I would contend that the church and the world are better for it. But if I'm going to end these lectures on a realistic note, I just have to say we still have a ways to go. There are still major challenges before us. Ordained women are still very much a minority in the worldwide Church of Christ. There are major bodies in our own land that do not ordain women and allow them to preach from their pulpits. Those of us who believe deeply in the ordination of women need to offer women who still struggle to live out their baptismal callings the encouragement, the support, the advocacy, all that we can muster. As Minerva Carcano beautifully put it, we need to become midwives of what newness God is wanting to bring to the life of the institutional church. We also need to think creatively with women and other marginalized persons who are currently denied ordination or prefer to preach from a non-ordained stance, and help them find places where they can live out their own baptismal callings rather than repressing them. In a related way, we also still have major work to do in making inclusive language for God and humans the norm in the worship of our land. I strongly believe this challenge is integrally related to women's ordination, because as long as we continue to use language that implies that God is male, we will also continue to believe in some deeply subconscious ways that women are lesser beings who do not deserve access to the pulpits of the land as fully as males do, and who are not fully created in God's image. Feminist theologian Mary Daly had it right 46 years ago when she said, if God is male, then male is God. And yet in many of the pulpits and liturgies of our land, we continue to pray to God as if God is male, to talk about God as if God is male, to use images for God that are primarily masculine in nature. What irreparable harm are we doing to our girls and our young women in the process? I have long been drawn to theologian Sally McFague's notion that the problem with our God language is a problem of idolatry. We have idolized father language and male language for God and made them the norm, rather than using a diversity of metaphorical language for our amazingly diverse God. And in order to set the balance right, says McFague, we need to call at least a partial moratorium on male language for God. Not because father language is never appropriate language for God, but because it is not the only appropriate language that can be used in relation to our God, who defies the limitations of any one human metaphor. I have to say that one of my own deep sadnesses and frustrations in ministry is that during the 40 years of my ordination to ministry, I often feel that we've gone backwards in terms of using inclusive language for God rather than forwards. I also believe the church's failure to embrace inclusive language is hurting our witness to younger generations, especially younger generations of women. I hope and pray that as more clergy women take their places in the pulpits of this land, we'll see a reversal of that trend. Finally, I want to say a word about race in women's preaching. One of the women who was most forthright with me in my interviews with her about the role race plays in her vocation was Jennifer Brooks. Brooks, professor of preaching at Garrett Evangelical Seminary, told me recently about being asked to write an endorsement for a new book in the field of preaching, and of carving out time from her very busy schedule to do so, only to find that when the book was published, all the endorsements on the back of the book were from white homileticians, with hers omitted. Brooks rightly called the press, not only to complain, but to tell them she would never again write an endorsement for one of their books. Brooks went on to tell me about other instances in which she felt race played a role, such as her difficulties in trying to recruit faculty for a D-Min program in preaching she now heads, or of not feeling the same camaraderie with white women at our academy that she does with her African American sisters, or of feeling that when she and some of her African American colleagues write a book about preaching, it is pigeonholed as an African American resource, not a resource for the entire field of preaching. I deeply appreciated her candor with me and her calling attention to the work we clearly need to do in my field regarding race and how it affects our working relationship. Race is always a complicated and difficult topic to address, but I hope in the years to come, the field of homiletics will be doing so in more systematic ways, so that when clergy women and scholars of clergy of color get that support they so rightly deserved. I am pleased to say that the topic for our next Academy meeting in December is unmasking homiletical whiteness. That's a good starting point. I want to end these lectures by paying tribute once again to Sister Joan Delaplane, the beloved first woman member and first woman president of the North American Academy of Homiletics. When I interviewed Sister Joan and asked her what final words she would like to say at the end of what ended up being about a 2-hour interview, this is what she said. Of all times, I think our present day and age needs the preached word as never before. I think we've lost our moorings. God is doing a new thing, and structures are coming down that have to come down in our nation and in our church. But in that process, we need to be rooted and grounded and hear the word of hope and love, and that our evolutionary God is working in the midst of this mess. That, dear friends, is what we preachers of the gospel, whether we are ordained or lay, male or female, cisgender or transgender, are called to preach. A word of hope and love, the promise that our God is somehow working in the midst of this mess, and the vision of a day when all people who are called to preach will be able to exercise that charism freely, fully, and without censorship. Let us pray and work for that day together.
Nora, when we invited you, we knew this would be the 5150 Year of Women at Yale, but we had no idea what topic you would choose. You could not have chosen a more appropriate topic, nor do I think you could have delivered it more powerfully. And the reaction of this audience, and I'm sure the reaction of the people who are watching via live stream, who are probably standing and applauding in front of their computer, is witness to that. So on behalf of everyone here, a very deep and heartfelt thanks for the 16 interviews, for the crafting and the thoughtfulness and the analyses that went into these lectures, which have challenged all of us. Thank you. We have a tradition on the final day of letting the audience or inviting the audience to ask questions. And I'm going to ask you, if you would, to stand. We will bring you, Claire will bring you the microphone. And if you'd simply identify yourself and pose your question, but please pose your question with some succinctness, if you would. So the floor is now open.
Hi, Nora.
Adele.
I'm Reverend Adele Crawford, class of 08, and one of Nora's Women's Ways of Preaching students here. I want to tell you briefly that I do a liturgy of communion with kids at the table, and I always invite some of them to hold up the bread or the cup. And one of my very favorite stories of ministry is not very long ago. There was a 9-year-old boy, and he said, I said, okay, kids, and which parts do you want to do? And he said, well, I really want to hold up either the bread or the cup, but I don't know if boys can do that. And I thought, good. And yes, Owen, you can do that. My question for you today is, as I look around the room, I see a number of men maybe of retirement age and not of retirement age, who are working in the midst of women who either are pastors or would like to be, or are discerning a call. What word do you have for them about ways they can mentor women, that beyond just saying, hey, you're talented, you should go? I think, what would you encourage them to do?
Yeah.
Or charge them to do?
My husband and I were recently at a 40th reunion of our seminary, some of our seminary classmates, and they were asking me about what I was going to do the lectures on, and I was talking to them about it. And one of the men there said, what I've tried to do all through my ministry is support and encourage women who want to go into ministry. He said that includes calling them to my staff, that it might include seeing their gifts and looking for their gifts and identifying their gifts. There's so many people who are in ministry because somebody said to them somewhere, sometime, I think you could be a minister. And I think part of it is intentionality about that, not just on the part of male clergy, but on the part of all parishioners as we look around our congregations and we say, who do we see having the gifts, the potential, the possibilities for becoming women in ministry or for going into ministry, period? I mean, certainly want to do that with our boys as well as our girls, but I think part of it is calling forth the gifts and then looking for openings where we can be supportive, where men can be supportive of women, whether it's hiring a woman on your staff and then working with her in a way that allows for an ongoing conversation about what is collegial and what isn't. I think that's where we have to sort of open ourselves up and be vulnerable and be willing to be a little critiqued, is to say, I may think I'm being highly collegial, and you may not think I'm being collegial at all, And so I think part of it is having the kind of weekly conversations, or having the openness so a woman can say to a male clergy person, you may not realize it, but you really undercut me in what you did right after I preached this week. I mean, I've heard those stories, but are the male colleagues open to hearing them and open to really dig deep and think about them? So those are a few things that come to mind. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Hopi Randall. And,
I know you, Hopi Randall.
I am a 2011 grad, and I'm currently working in the admissions office. I was raised in 3 very conservative traditions in the Caribbean and never heard women preach. And I did not find a preaching voice until I took my first class with Nora and Tom. I had never preached before, but Nora and Tom helped me to see that I had something to say. And so my life has changed because of this woman standing here. One of the questions I wanted to ask was, you've interviewed these 4 mothers, and we've heard about the harm that has been done, the patriarchy, the misogyny, all of that. Did anyone mention or allude to the harm done by women who are still residing in congregations who believe that women are still not called to preach? I preached in a church somewhere and was told after that was really nice, but women are not supposed to preach. This was coming from mothers of the church. So what can you say? Did anyone allude to that, and what do you say to that?
Well, yeah, I talked, I guess was it yesterday, about Teresa Fry Brown and the women in her first church literally turning their backs on her and sitting with their backs to her when she read the scriptures or prayed, and how difficult that was. There's a follow-up to that story, though, and she told about how one of the leaders in this group, it had just been so painful for her, later when, I don't know how much of this to go into, later when she was in a difficult situation with a male person in that congregation, this woman intervened and then had her back from then on. I mean, they sort of broke through this barrier, and I think she came to see her as a human being who had vulnerabilities as well as strength, and broke through this barrier, and they became really good friends in the process. That doesn't always happen, but it really doesn't. But I think part of what we need to recognize is that misogyny is not just a male thing. Misogyny is cultural, and people have been forged in it, men and women. And so that while it's sometimes the most horrific for women to experience it for women, I think part of what we have to realize is this is what our culture has taught women to think. They didn't come to this on their own. This is what the church has taught them to think. So it's not that we are, I think that just helps a little bit with understanding where it's coming from, that it's not always so personal and vicious as it feels. It is a part of the fallen sinfulness of our whole culture that I think women share in as well as men. And, the only redemption for that is some heavy doses of Jesus' grace. and some hard talk. You know, I think sometimes we just need to sit down with people and say, I want to tell you how it affects me when you say those things to me. I remember a couple who came to us in our very first parish, and they were from a very conservative background, and they had just gotten this clergy couple, and they didn't know what to do with this woman who was their new minister. I mean, there were no women on the session. They never had a woman. And they wanted to sit down with me, and they wanted to know why I was doing what I was doing. And instead of getting really defensive, which I could have easily done, I just walked them through my story of call. I said, this is not what I set out to do. This was one of those surprises of God in my life. I went to seminary vowing I was never going to preach, and the Spirit got hold of me. And it was amazing what that one conversation did to ease antipathy and to help them see that this for me was a God thing. It wasn't just a personal advancement thing or me wanting to be just like the men, It was a God thing, and I think that helped. There are no easy answers, Hopi, you know that. But, yeah.
So my name is Alan Kendricks.
Yes.
And because my wife was here, I found out late that I could audit classes. And one of the classes that I audited was your women's way of preaching. And it was life-changing for me. How many other men have taken the opportunity to take that class while you were teaching here?
There have been a few brave ones along the way like you. There have been. It's interesting, when I taught at Princeton Seminary, it was often visiting scholars, male visiting scholars from other countries. I'll never forget one of them coming to me saying, I've got women in my classes, I haven't a clue what to do with them. Can I sit down on your women's ways of I said, yes, indeed. We'd be delighted to have you. But there have been, I was sort of looking back through my class rolls actually before I came down here and realizing that there have been through the years, almost every year, one or maybe two men, not usually more than that. It was always sort of a hard thing to call on my part, because the last thing I wanted the class to have to do was to defend themselves against somebody who came in with a bad spirit about this whole thing. I knew you weren't that kind. I already knew you. But anyhow, but yeah, so there have been some. But again, there was a tension in that class because I wanted it to be safe space for women. That was my top priority, was to have it to be safe space for women where they could really come and be honest about the struggles, the challenges, the thing they were facing. So the few men who have taken it have also been a mighty great group of men. I mean that sincerely.
Hi, Nora. I'm
Hi,
Shelley Stackhouse, the Reverend Dr, and I'm the pastor currently of Center Church in Hartford, United Church of Christ. And I used to hang here, and I went to that other seminary where you taught, not this one. So this is an incredible list of women, some of whom I know and have heard and am just awed by, have learned from. I have a challenge for you for your next book after you do the Beecher.
Good luck, Shelley. Go ahead.
I challenge you to do the same thing with women who are preaching week to week to week in churches all over the United States.
Yeah.
And hear their words and share them. Social media is a wonderful thing, and I'm part of a Facebook group of UCC clergy women. And I'm learning so much. I mean, I've been doing this for 37 years. I'm learning so much about preaching from my colleagues there. So
I take that. I mean, I think that is a fair and important thing. I was aware of that gap. I just, it took me months to do 16. Line those up, tape them. No, I know you're not, but I also think, I'll never forget when I wrote, I guess it was the prophetic preaching group, this group of women who are my first Women's Ways of Preaching class. I took it to them. I took a prior manuscript of it to them and said, what does this book need that it doesn't have? That's what they said it needed. She said, you've got all these big name homiletical people in here, but you need some down on the ground preacher types in here, modeling their sermons and what they're doing in prophetic preaching. And I thought, they are so right. So I went back to the drawing board. So, okay, well, thank you.
Here, and then Julie, and then Jenny. We got three.
Mm-hmm.
For the past 3 years, we've had a wonderful African-American woman as our pastor. And the Orthodox Church talks about people having the logos, having the Spirit down within them in a wonderful combination of emotion and intellect. And Elizabeth Clement, who was the pastor, had that. And so many times I thought what a blessing it was to have a woman preaching to us every Sunday. And the churches that fail to ordain women are just not aware of what they're missing and what they're losing from this. That's a comment. My question.
Thank you for it.
I find, though I have supported the women's movement for years, I find my wife is quick to point out at times a certain a sense of male privilege that still exists within me, that creeps out at times in surprising ways. And I'm wondering what guidance, what help there may be, apart from simply being confronted, which I think is wonderful, but apart from that, to help men get past that sense of privilege which almost unconsciously has been generated by our culture from previous generations.
Wow. I mean, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your vulnerability and honesty and in naming that reality. It is clearly a reality. I'm not sure I know what the fix is. I just got to be quite honest. I certainly know what you're talking about. I've certainly encountered it in life. But I honestly think you take the first step when you acknowledge that you need some help in that area. To me, that is huge. To name it, to acknowledge it, and I think to just, from time to time, say that to the women in your life and say, where am I doing this that I'm not even aware of? I'll never forget a pastor in a church, this was soon after I graduated from seminary in Richmond, Virginia. I heard from some women in his church that he had asked a group of women there to write him a note anytime he did anything that was offensive in the pulpit to them. I thought, oh my gosh, I've never heard of anybody else doing that in my life, frankly. But it was his way of opening. He had a little team of women in the church, and he knew they were outspoken enough to do this. And he said, would you please, if I use an example that's offensive to you, if I use language, if I do anything in my sermon that is offensive, would you please let me know? And I thought that was sort of a model, for how to invite the community to help you with that, again, enculturated sense of male privilege. So I think it's a community endeavor, not just an individual endeavor. I think we need the help of the community in helping us see what we cannot always see in ourselves.
I'm Julie Kelsey, and I just have a quick comment. I'm lucky enough to be on the preaching team with Tom and Nora, and I just want to thank you for all the ways in which you have been a foremother, not just for me, but for all the students whose lives you have touched, to thank you for your courage, to thank you for all the ways you make the invisible visible to those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Hi, I'm Jenny Peek, a very recent student of Professor Tisdale's. A quick word of thanks. I've had many powerful female mentors in my life, including yourself, but these past 3 days in this lecture series has anchored and grounded me and made me feel proud of claiming my specifically femaleness as a minister in a totally new way, so thank you for that. But a question, you mentioned this critique in one of the days, but people who identify how the decreasing of the church in terms of numbers and funding and salaries, identifying female ministers as being a part of why that's happening. And so I wonder how you would respond, and if any of the studies or people you spoke to spoke of experiences of kind of congregational vitality or growth happening as a result of female ministers instead of
the opposite.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can. I did. That wasn't a question I was asking people, so I didn't get a lot of feedback for these lectures in it. I can sure testify in my church in Durham that it is thriving. And it had pretty much an almost all female staff when I got there. But it's interesting. The person who who raised that question, well, first of all, I just got to go back to, when I was in seminary, our theology professor, that's what was his constant, well, one of our theology professors, his constant mantra was how women were going to completely feminize the church so that men didn't want to be there anymore. That was his prediction for the future, that it would become the feminization of the church and it would just kill Christianity, basically. In his eyes, I think it really would have. I'm serious. I'm not even going to. But the one person, it's interesting, in my interviews that talked about that concern was Maggie Wenig, talking about Jewish synagogues and how she felt like they were, this is a woman talking, but saying how she felt like they were seeing some of the diminishment of male involvement and how bad that was for their financial resources and other resources in the church. So I really pondered that and whether to address it here, and I thought, I guess I have to confess I haven't seen that corresponding thing in Christian churches with which I'm familiar. And I don't know of statistical studies that have been done on it. It would be interesting to know. But I do know plenty of churches. One of the big surprises for me in moving to Durham, North Carolina, was that there are 4 or 5 churches in the Raleigh-Durham area who have as their senior pastors women I've taught. I was so shocked. I move in my neighborhood in Durham. I walk a block and a half to Watts Baptist Church. Doris Ann Cooper, a kick-ass Baptist woman, is heading that church. Oh, is this still being... Anyhow. Then I got Mindy's a former student of mine. Different seminaries, different eras. But it has been so gratifying, given the statistics we talked about this week, where only 11% of all the congregations in the U.S. have a woman as senior or solo pastor, to see these women out there thriving, and their churches are thriving. So I guess what I see all around me is the opposite of that. I don't see, men are not fleeing First Presbyterian Church in Durham, where I worship. They are there in multitudes on Sunday morning. And I think part of it is that the longer people get used to women in ministry, the longer they see this. I mean, you know, I don't even think they think about it that much, that women in ministry in my church anymore. They've got Mindy and she's good, you know, and that's all that matters. But I think what I hope is that we're going to move beyond that, you know. It might be an initial sort of knee-jerk reaction, oh, that's a woman, I can't talk to her, I don't want her in my pulpit. But I think we're moving beyond that, and that's what I see as being pretty exciting in ministry.
Would you join me in saying a special thank you to